All right, we are back at it today. We got a big one, the causes of the Spanish-American War. So, the Spanish-American War originates with conflicting ideologies of what the United States is going to want to be, what we see ourselves as. Was the United States a country that favored the idea of self-determination, that belief that people should rule themselves, just as we had done as we broke from the British Empire in 1776? Or were we a country that espoused ideas of manifest destiny and social Darwinism, civilizing mission, that the United States was a superior nation and a superior people that should export our ideal government for the benefit of others around the world? Advocates of a so-called large policy for the United States would ultimately win the day, that the United States should move away from its non-interventionism and join the great powers. So while we're going to talk a big game about self-determination, the United States is ultimately going to be an intervening nation. Now, when we look at Cuba on the American southeastern coast, about 90 miles away from Florida. It had been a Spanish colony since 1511, and by the 19th century, it was the world's largest sugar producer. Now, there had been divides in Cuba between a Spanish descended white plantation owning class and the mixed race peoples that were more excluded from the economy and the political power in Spain. By the late 19th century, as the rest of Latin American countries had gained their independence, protests and rebellions against Spanish rule grew. And in 1895, Cuban revolutionary leader Jose Marti, you can see him right here, launched a major rebellion against Spain, and the Spanish responded brutally to this. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans were imprisoned in horrid conditions. Thousands would die. This led some in the United States to support intervention. Spain would make concessions towards Cuban autonomy in hopes of keeping the United States out of Cuba. Now, Cuba, being just 90 miles off the southeastern coast, was always in the back of Americans' minds. The United States had actually attempted to buy Cuba on a few occasions. Remember, we bought other pieces of land, the Gadsden Purchase, the Louisiana Purchase, Alaska. Cuba could just be another piece of territory that we purchase. There were desires to take control of Cuban sugar production and tobacco production. It would also be a strategic naval base in the Caribbean. The United States, by the end of the 19th century, was Cuba's largest trading partner, even bigger than that of Spain. Now, with that 1890 McKinley tariff, remember that was when William McKinley was in Congress, duties on Cuban sugar were ended. And this concerned a lot of American sugar producers that they couldn't compete with this new product coming on the market without tariffs. Also, there were concerns that these rebellions started in 1895 by Jose Marti and other revolutionaries would threaten American businesses. Well, by 1898, with William McKinley as the president of the United States will ultimately declare war. And we got a lot of factors that contribute to this. One of the most mentioned is what is known as the Yellow Press, this journalism, particularly centered in New York City, that contributed to anti-Spanish sentiments regarding the Cuban story. Two of the main parties in this were New York's William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. Yes, he's the guy with the prize named after him, whose newspapers traded sensationalist articles to drive sales of their papers. But it ultimately was also shaping many Americans' views on Cuba. William Randolph Hearst was famous for saying, if you furnish the pictures of the atrocities in Cuba, I will furnish the war. And of course, for guys that are selling newspapers, this kind of development and even a war that could come along would sell many more newspapers. The yellow press papers, however, cannot be the only factor. They did not reach the entire country. There's got to be other things at play. Some American businesses were pushing for war. American businesses with holdings in Cuba supported interventionism. They saw the rebellion as threatening their interests in Cuba. The rebels were using a scorched earth tactic where many lands were being destroyed, and some of these lands were owned by American companies, so they would support intervention. President William McKinley obviously plays a major role here. In 1898, a letter from a Spanish ambassador to the United States was fell into the hands of William Randolph Hearst and published in his New York Journal. In this Delome letter, or Delome letter, the letter ridiculed McKinley as a small-time politician. Now, Delome would ultimately be forced to resign by the Spanish government. Spain apologized, but the insult inflamed anti-Spanish sentiments in the White House. Then in February of 1898, the U.S. battleship Maine exploded in Havana Harbor. 266 American crewmen were killed. Now, this explosion may have been an accident, but the United States and our press immediately blamed Spain, with William Randolph Hearst unfoundingly claiming that a torpedo or a mine struck the battleship and caused its destruction. Now, Spain denied responsibility, offered payment for the destruction, but the yellow press ran with the story with cries of "Remember the Maine." William McKinley was on the fence himself about military intervention, but in 1898, this is what we would call a midterm election year. Remember, our presidential election years in the United States are every 4 years on the multiple of four. So McKinley was elected in 96. So 2 years later, we have the midterm elections where a third of the Senate and one third of the Congress, or pardon me, one third of the Senate and all of the Congress needs to run for re-election. And Republican William McKinley did not want to be perceived as weak as his party might suffer in that election. Sensing a looming American intervention against Spain, the rebels in Cuba escalated their attacks. And by April 20th, McKinley would ask for a congressional approval for force in Cuba to support Cuban revolutionaries against Spain. Now, this would be included with what is known as the Teller Amendment. The Teller Amendment added to this support for force said that the United States had no intention of annexing any Cuban territory, that the United States was only supporting Cuban independence, and that the United States had no ulterior motives in Cuba. Trust us. This would be passed to ultimately placate many American Protestants who were concerned about Cuba being a large Catholic nation, and also some American sugar producers who didn't own land in Cuba were worried if an annexation came, that would be a lot of competition for new cheap sugar. So ultimately, the United States does declare war. We've got a number of factors involved there, and we will see you next time with the effects of all of this.